Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 13 in a series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I hope that each of these episodes will stand on its own, but if you're the sort of person who likes to have the full context of a story, those earlier episodes are available for you to go back and listen to at your leisure. Last week, I talked about the conditions of life in the Soviet Union in the late 1940s and early 1950s, during the last years of Stalin's reign. This week, I will cover the events surrounding the death of Stalin and the ensuing struggle for power between his deputies. This is The End of History, Part 13. When I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of movies. Some of my younger listeners may not remember a time before the existence of streaming services, when you actually had to go out to your local video store, which in my experience was later replaced by a Blockbuster, and pick out your movies on a Friday or Saturday night. But this was one of the quintessential experiences of my childhood. I loved movies. I loved, and still love, the experience of being transported outside of my life to an exciting world where exciting things were happening. I watched all kinds of movies, but my favorite movies were always period pieces, historical fiction, and movies supposedly based on a true story. I always found the stories to be more exciting when I knew, or at least thought, that this was real. People actually experienced this time and place, and the heroes of the story had actually done the heroic deeds portrayed in the film. I found that particularly exciting and inspiring. This was the main root of my love of history. I would watch a historical movie and I would be so excited by the story that I wanted to know more. I would immerse myself in the story and the period and go gobble up as much information about it as I could. One movie that was an early inspiration for me was the 1995 blockbuster Braveheart, starring Mel Gibson. I don't think I can overstate how much I loved this movie. I watched it over and over. It was an incredibly well-made movie that immersed me completely in the story and left me wanting more. One of my earliest journeys as a student of history was my pursuit of William Wallace, the famed Scottish rebel who was the subject of the movie Braveheart. The more I learned about the real Braveheart, however, the more I noticed the sometimes extreme differences between the story depicted in the film and the real story of William Wallace. Braveheart is an extremely historically inaccurate film, even as Hollywood movies go, which is, as I learned, really saying something. Anyone with even a passing knowledge of medieval Scottish history knows that they got just about everything about the period wrong. The Scottish heroes were unrealistically good, the English villains were unrealistically evil, the battle scenes took no account of the tactics, weapons, or armor of the period, and don't even get me started about the kilts. Nobody wore kilts in Scotland in the early 14th century. To this day, I'm very conflicted about Braveheart. On one hand, as a work of fiction, I think it still stands up as a masterpiece of storytelling. On the other, it purports to tell a true story, and the average person will come away knowing less about William Wallace and the medieval world than they did before they watched it. At the same time, it did jumpstart my budding love of history and inspired me to go learn the real history behind it. In the end, I chose not to let it ruin my love of history or historical movies, but I did learn a valuable lesson about viewing Hollywood historical movies with a critical eye, especially the ones made by Mel Gibson. Over the years, I've learned that some period pieces are significantly more accurate than others. The HBO series Band of Brothers and Rome both come to mind as particularly good and relatively authentic, but none of them are perfect. At the end of the day, the filmmaker's primary purpose is to entertain rather than educate, and we should be very wary of relying on them to teach us about history. But Hollywood movies and TV period pieces can inspire us to immerse ourselves in a period and can be useful in prompting discussion of it. Along these lines, some of my absolute favorite historical movies are the ones that don't take themselves too seriously. comedies and satires that poke fun at and provide commentary on a particular time period without purporting to accurately represent it. I think the British comedy troupe Monty Python did this exceptionally well in The Holy Grail and The Life of Brian. One of the rare films that manages to combine satire with historical authenticity and is, in my opinion, severely underrated is the 2017 film The Death of Stalin. The film is obviously a comedy, and at no point do you get the sense that you're watching a documentary. I think one of the reasons the movie is so good is that the authenticity is understated. If you watched it and weren't familiar with the actual story of the events surrounding the death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953, you might not even know just how accurate it is. The filmmakers did, of course, take liberties with the facts, as is done in all historical movies. And at times these liberties were quite broad. As a whole, though, the biggest liberty is the compression of the timeline. They depicted events that actually happened over several months as having happened over the course of a few days. But unlike Braveheart, if you were to watch The Death of Stalin and you didn't know much or anything about the events depicted, you would come away knowing more about what unfolded in the Soviet Union in 1953 than you did before. I think the reason they were able to pull this off so well is because the true story of the death of Joseph Stalin and its aftermath is patently absurd. And absurdity makes for great comedy. So it wasn't necessary for them to stray too far from the facts in order to tell a good story. Joseph Stalin was one of the most brutal dictators in human history. But when he died in March 1953, he had been the most powerful man in the Soviet Union for nearly 30 years and had ruled as an absolute dictator for the vast majority of that time. An entire generation had grown up in the shadow of his dictatorship, and for better or worse, this dictatorship represented continuity and a kind of stability. It was all they knew. The entire system revolved around him, and was designed due to his paranoia about internal enemies attempting to overthrow him so that it could not function without him. So when he suffered a massive stroke on March 1st, 1953, nobody really knew what to do. On the evening of February 28, 1953, Stalin summoned his four closest lieutenants, Georgy Malenkov, Lavrenti Beria, Nikolai Bulganin, and Nikita Khrushchev, to his office in the Kremlin to discuss the business of state. Stalin was a night owl, and most of his important work was done at night. He required his closest lieutenants and advisors to also maintain his nocturnal schedule. He ruled over these four men as he did the rest of the country, with a combination of carrots and sticks, but his primary tools were fear and ambition. His subordinates were constantly maneuvering to undercut, undermine, and outshine one another to climb the ladder to the highest rung of Stalin's good graces. Stalin certainly understood this game, and he ensured that none of these men ever felt completely safe or secure in their positions. He fostered constant competition between them to ensure that they were focused on each other, and nobody was ever able to focus their scheming against him. Stalin was an incredibly hard worker. It's one of the traits that facilitated his rise to power in the first place, and his work ethic did not abate after he took power. He expected the same ironclad work ethic from his subordinates. At the same time, Stalin could be incredibly charming and sociable. This is the other main trait that had facilitated his rise to power. When work was finished that evening, he invited his associates to watch a movie with him. Stalin, like me, was a lover of cinema, and he had overseen the construction of the first movie theater in the Kremlin. I don't know exactly which movie they watched that evening. Stalin liked to screen all kinds of films in his personal theater, but his favorites were always American westerns. Stalin loved westerns so much that it inspired the Soviet film industry to create the genre of the Soviet Eastern. This film genre followed all the general tropes that were popular in American westerns, but generally took place in Soviet Central Asia. The genre would outlive Stalin and encompass some of the most classic films of Soviet cinema. When the film was over that evening, Stalin invited the four men to dine with him at his near dacha in the Moscow suburb of Volinskaya. When I say invited, you shouldn't be confused into thinking the men had any option. Staying in Stalin's good graces was a matter of life and death, and thus his every whim was obeyed. If he wished them to dine at his dacha, even at a ridiculously late hour, they would dine at his dacha. And when I say dine, I don't mean that they would just sit and eat a meal, though food would certainly be served. Dining with Stalin at his dacha inevitably meant getting very, very drunk. Stalin certainly enjoyed heavy drinking, but his purpose in this ritual was not purely hedonistic. Stalin could hold his liquor very well, and no matter how much he imbibed, seemed to retain his senses. He liked to get those close to him drunk, so that he could observe their behavior. A man who is under the influence has fewer inhibitions and will say things he might not otherwise have said. Stalin saw this as a way of figuring out what his subordinates were really thinking, and also of gauging their loyalty. It was not uncommon for one of Stalin's close associates to be arrested immediately after one of these drinking bouts over something he let slip while his inhibitions were lowered. Inevitably, those who managed to remain in Stalin's inner circle were those who could also hold their liquor. Thus, each of the four men had at least the capacity for very heavy drinking. We know, for instance, from Khrushchev's memoirs that he secretly loathed Stalin, but he held his liquor well enough to keep this to himself through countless drunken nights with the dictator. Nikita Khrushchev later recalled that it was probably 5 or 6 in the morning on March 1st when the dinner party finally broke up and the men stumbled out of the dacha to make their way home. Khrushchev stated that everyone was in good spirits and there was no cause for anyone to think anything was wrong. He said that as they stumbled out of the dacha, Stalin was quite tipsy himself and was poking him in the belly and calling him by the Ukrainian version of his name, Mikita, something Khrushchev said he only did when he was in a very good mood. Stalin retired to bed after his associates left. The guards and staff of his dacha knew better than to disturb him in his quarters. They, like the inner circle and indeed the entire country, were deathly afraid of invoking Stalin's wrath by disturbing him when he did not wish to be disturbed. As the entire day of March 1st went by and nobody heard anything from Stalin, the guards and staff started to become worried, but nobody dared go into the room to check on him, afraid that disturbing him would anger him. Finally, late on the evening of March 1st, the mail arrived, giving the staff an acceptable excuse to check on the dictator. A bodyguard entered Stalin's private apartment to bring him his mail, and discovered him lying on the floor in a puddle of his own urine. He was apparently unable to speak, but later accounts indicate that he made a hand gesture to the bodyguard, beckoning him to approach. The man called his colleagues, and they lifted Stalin out of the puddle onto a couch. The household staff was crippled by fear. None of them wanted to make the wrong decision and invoke Stalin's wrath, so none of them made any decisions at all. Instead, the bodyguards, members of the NKVD, sought instructions from their superior, who sought instructions from his superior. The entire system was predicated on Stalin himself having the final authority and making the important decisions. Since he was incapacitated, nobody quite knew who was in charge, and they all knew the consequences of exceeding their authority. What ensued was a kind of a complex game of telephone, where one official would call his superior, who would call his superior, until ultimately a call was placed to Politburo member Georgy Malenkov. Malenkov also did not want to take individual responsibility, so he placed calls to the other members of Stalin's inner circle, the men mentioned before, Bulganin, Beria, Khrushchev, who agreed that they would meet at Stalin's dacha and make any necessary decisions collectively, so as to avoid any one of them having to take responsibility for any decisions made in the event of Stalin's recovery. According to Khrushchev's memoirs, when they arrived at the dacha, they were informed by the staff that Stalin was sleeping. Not wanting to disturb him or make their presence officially known, they chose to think that since he was sleeping, he must be recovering, and everything was fine, so they returned to their homes. A few hours later, Khrushchev said that he received another call stating that Stalin's condition was not improving, and that though he was sleeping, his sleep was, quote, not normal. The four men once again agreed to meet at Stalin's dacha and discuss what to do. Finally, the decision was made to summon a doctor. Stalin is thought to have suffered a severe stroke in the early morning hours of March 1st, 1953. By the time a doctor was summoned to examine him, more than a day had passed, while the various parties sought to avoid responsibility by delegating and deliberating. When the doctors did finally arrive at the dacha on the morning of March 2nd, 1953, their opinions were universally grim. The cardiologist Alexander Myasnikov, one of the doctors summoned to examine Stalin, later recalled in his memoir, quote, "The diagnosis was clear to us, thank God. Hemorrhage in the left cerebral hemisphere of the brain caused by hypertonia and atherosclerosis." End quote. I'm not a medical professional, but in layman's terms, that means that the blood vessels in his brain were rigid and that the buildup blocked the flow of blood through them until a pool of blood accumulated and eventually burst. The autopsy later confirmed this diagnosis. Even before Stalin died, efforts were made by his subordinates to establish some kind of collective rule. That is, a power-sharing arrangement to deal with the transition. Collective rule had been the hallmark of the early Bolshevik regime under Lenin. Lenin had been the clear first among equals, but major decisions had been made collectively by the entire Communist Party Central Committee. There were even times when Lenin had been outvoted by the Central Committee and forced to conform to the will of the majority. Stalin spent the last 20 years concentrating power in the hands of one individual, him, and working to consign all vestiges of collective rule to the dustbin of history. As we discussed in episode 5, I think part of the motivation for the Great Purge was to eliminate not just the functions of collective rule from the party, but its very memory. Those who had a memory of sitting on a central committee during a time when decisions were made collectively through a more democratic process were a threat to Stalin's concentration of power, and they had to be eliminated. Now, a new generation of party leaders on the Politburo, most of whom had either joined the party after the revolution or had occupied low positions in its ranks during the time of Lenin, sought to restore that collective rule. They weren't doing this out of any high-minded idealism, but rather because it was the only thing to do. The four men from Stalin's inner circle, Beria, Bulganin, Malenkov, and Khrushchev, wielded the most power, but none of them possessed the political capital to establish a Stalin-like dictatorship to replace him. Stalin had essentially seen to it that there was no clear successor or plan for the succession were something to happen to him. To have such a plan with a man waiting in the wings to succeed him, Stalin thought, would only motivate such a man to overthrow him and seize power. Though they were rivals, they would have to cooperate with one another to avoid a complete collapse of the system, something none of them wanted. On March 5th, amid the jockeying for position between members of the Politburo, Stalin, having been unconscious for days, finally succumbed to the effects of the stroke and passed away. At first, it appeared that Georgy Malenkov was in the strongest position to emerge as the new leader of the Soviet Union. He was already serving as the premier, which made him the de jure head of government, and he appeared poised to be elected as the leader of the Politburo as well, which would have made him the de facto leader of the country. Indeed, he did assume this role on an acting basis immediately after Stalin's death, and he appeared poised to make the position permanent. I talked briefly about Malenkov last week, but it's worth going into just a little bit more detail on his background now. Born in Orenburg in 1902, Malenkov had joined the ranks of the Red Army to fight in the Civil War at the age of 16 in 1918. He quickly stood out for his work ethic and dedication to the communist ideology, and in 1920, at the age of 18, he officially joined the party and became a political commissar in the Red Army, where he served as a propaganda officer in Central Asia during the Red Army's campaign to assert control over the region during and after the Civil War. In 1924, he got noticed by Stalin, who was impressed by the young man and singled him out for preferment and advancement. He quickly rose through the ranks of the Communist Party apparatus, serving in various roles until he was nominated to join the Politburo in 1941 on a conditional basis. From there, he continued to serve on the Politburo, developing a reputation for ruthlessness and deep, unquestioning loyalty to Stalin, which only further secured his rise. By the early 1950s, he was understood by many to be Stalin's right hand. Malenkov's main rival for power in 1953 appeared to be the leader of the state security apparatus, Lavrentiy Beria. Beria, like Stalin, was a native of Georgia. He had been born into an upper-middle-class family in Georgia in 1899. He later moved to Baku, in modern-day Azerbaijan, to study at the Baku Polytechnic Institute. After the revolution, he is rumored to have worked with the short-lived Musavist regime in Baku, though he always vehemently denied this and claimed that he joined the Bolsheviks in 1917 while a student. According to the memoirs of Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, Beria barely escaped execution for his anti-Bolshevik activities in the revolutionary period. By 1920, he had managed to repair his reputation and was recruited to join the Cheka, the Bolshevik Party's secret police. He proved to be a particularly adept intelligence agent and rose through the ranks of the secret police, becoming deputy chairman of the security services in the Transcaucasian Soviet Republic in 1922. In 1924, he led the pro-Soviet forces against an attempted Georgian national uprising, and in the aftermath, cemented his reputation for ruthlessness by ordering the execution of thousands. His successful repression of the uprising led to his appointment as chairman of the security forces for the newly formed Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. He met Stalin in 1931 during a visit by the dictator to his native country. Stalin was impressed by him and used his influence to ensure Beria's election as the first secretary of the Georgian Communist Party. Beria then used the years of the purges to eliminate his political rivals in the entire Transcaucasian region. Then, in 1938, Stalin appointed him as head of the NKVD to replace the denounced Nikolai Yezhov. Beria's conduct as head of the NKVD is where his reputation for brutality and sadism were cemented. He seems to have been one of those thankfully rare individuals in history who really enjoyed hurting people. He not only had no problem with ordering prisoners tortured during interrogation, he was known to personally join in and conduct various forms of torture personally. According to one source I read, he even joined in on executions and would occasionally personally shoot prisoners. In addition to the sadism he exhibited in his official capacity, Beria was also a serial rapist. He would order his guards to bring women to his dacha, where he would dine with them, and he would take them into a soundproof room that he had had built in the house, where he would rape them. As they left, Beria's victims would be given bouquets of flowers, their acceptance of which was an agreement that the encounter had been consensual. On one occasion, when a woman refused to accept the flowers, Beria allegedly said, quote, "Now it is a wreath. May it rot on your grave," end quote. There is also speculation, though not conclusively proven, that Beria murdered some of his victims. In the 1990s, Russian construction crews inadvertently unearthed 2 mass graves filled with the bones of young women near Beria's Moscow residence. The age of these bones indicates that these women were killed during the time Beria lived there, though it has never, to my knowledge, been conclusively proven that he killed them. In the aftermath of Stalin's death, Beria was named as the first deputy premier, making him, on paper, the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union after Georgy Malenkov. He also still commanded the loyalty of the state security apparatus and the secret police, which made him a formidable opponent. On March 6, 1953, the day Stalin's death was announced to the public, the New York Times published an article profiling the various members of the Politburo, listing them in order of the power and influence they wielded in the post-Stalin government of the Soviet Union. The first 2 names on that list were Georgy Malenkov and Lavrentiy Beria. The very last name on that list, included almost as an afterthought, was Nikita Khrushchev. Indeed, in the aftermath of Stalin's death, Malenkov and Beria, neither of whom thought much of Khrushchev, immediately moved to sideline him by removing him from his post as head of the Moscow Communist Party, purportedly so that he could focus on his other unspecified duties as a member of the Politburo. They thought, wrongly as it would turn out, that Khrushchev's only base of support came from his leadership of the Moscow party apparatus, and that by removing him from that post, any potential threat he might pose to their consolidation of power was eliminated. Malenkov and Beria were both men who preferred to obtain their goals through what I like to call hard power, that is, rule by fear and force. Khrushchev, on the other hand, was a soft power kind of man. He tended to be much less direct, and he accomplished his goals through persuasion rather than coercion. Malenkov and Beria were both feared and respected, but neither of them were particularly well liked. Khrushchev, on the other hand, was a charmer. He was funny and likable. One of the reasons Stalin kept him around was because he could make him laugh. He could also be terribly persuasive. He was one of the few men who was ever able to change Stalin's mind or talk him out of an ill-advised venture that he had set his mind to. Khrushchev realized that he alone could never rival Malenkov or Beria, but that the rest of the Politburo members together, if brought to his side, would be terribly formidable. He also sought to divide and conquer Malenkov and Beria. Seeing Beria with his sadistic psychopathy and command over the security forces as by far the greater threat to both him personally and to the people of the USSR, Khrushchev sought to win over Malenkov against him, which he eventually did. But even a unanimous decision of the Politburo could not threaten Beria with the entire state security apparatus standing behind him. So Khrushchev turned to the only force in the USSR that could rival Beria's security forces, the Red Army. In particular, to rally the army to his side, he turned to one man, our old friend Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov, as the great hero of the Battle of Moscow and the conqueror of Berlin, was revered as a war hero by the people, and though he had fallen from favor in Stalin's final years due to Stalin's fear of the popularity he had achieved, he still commanded the respect and loyalty of the Red Army. Zhukov largely blamed the machinations of Beria for his fall from favor with Stalin, something he wasn't entirely wrong about, and he was eager for revenge. He also saw an opportunity to restore himself to favor with the government and perhaps to garner additional power for himself, and he seized the opportunity, forming a secret alliance with Khrushchev. In approaching Zhukov, it's also possible that Khrushchev was looking ahead to forming a future government under his leadership. One of the policies he hoped to pursue was a thaw in relations with the West, and it was well known that Zhukov had developed a friendship with Dwight Eisenhower after the war, when they were each in command of their country's respective occupation zones in Berlin. Eisenhower had been inaugurated as the 34th President of the United States less than 2 months earlier, and I think it's possible Khrushchev thought Zhukov's cooperation could be helpful in a potential softening of relations with the United States. On March 14th, the Politburo, Khrushchev having worked his magic on them, expressed concern about the leadership of both the government and the party being vested in the same person, and forced Malenkov to resign as head of the party, though he maintained his position as head of the government. From this time, Khrushchev took effective control of the party leadership, though he would not be formally voted in to the position until September 1953. Over the next 3 months, from March to June 1953, Khrushchev slowly expanded his power over the party, winning over the other Politburo members with a combination of charm and classic political horse trading. I won't go into detail on all of the various machinations that took place during this time. Khrushchev himself goes into great detail on this in his memoirs, so if you're interested, I will point you in the direction of that work. For our purposes, I will just say that by June, he had won over the other Politburo members and was ready to stage a coup. On June 26, 1953, the members of the Politburo, including Beria, gathered for what seemed like a routine meeting. The meeting went on for roughly 2 hours, and then, toward the end, Georgy Malenkov, who had been persuaded to lead the way, stood and denounced Beria. Beria, who seems to have been taken completely by surprise, sat in silence at first as various members of the Politburo took the floor and denounced him with a litany of accusations. Khrushchev, the mastermind behind it all, was particularly cutting in his remarks. He accused Beria of trying to, quote, undermine socialism and legalize arbitrary rule, end quote. He stated that Beria was, quote, no communist, but rather, quote, he is a careerist who has wormed his way into the party for self-seeking reasons. His arrogance is intolerable. No honest communist would ever behave the way he does, end quote. Among the allegations made were also those of a more personal and less political nature, including accusations of rape and sexual deviancy that turned out to be entirely substantiated by the evidence, unlike some of the political charges made against him. Finally, Malenkov pressed a button that had been prepared for him beneath the table that sent the signal to Zhukov and the other military men waiting outside to come in and arrest Beria. They burst into the room, and Zhukov personally placed Beria under arrest. Beria was expelled from the Communist Party and arrested pending an investigation of the charges against him. 6 months later, on December 23, 1953, Beria was tried by a special session of the Supreme Court of the USSR. He had no right to defense counsel, and he was denied the right to testify in his own defense. He was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death. Like so many of his own victims before him, Beria broke down at the end, falling to his knees and begging for his life before he was unceremoniously dispatched by a bullet to the head. But rather than signaling a new round of show trials and purges as such executions always had in the past, the execution of Beria signaled an end to the darkest era of Soviet repression. Nikita Khrushchev now reigned supreme over the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He was not a perfect man by any means, and he certainly was not a liberal Democrat, and I use that phrase with a small L and a small d, not referring to the American political party. But his rise did represent a turning point in the history of the USSR. A new day was dawning, and Khrushchev's thaw and campaign to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union would define the next decade of the country's history. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I encourage you to follow and engage with us on social media and to visit our website at www.thehistorysphere.com. If you like what you heard, you can support the podcast with a monthly donation on Spotify. If you don't have Spotify or you prefer to listen elsewhere, you can also support us on Patreon. The link to our Patreon can be found on the website. If you can't afford to support us right now, I get it. The History Sphere is free. You can also support the show by giving us a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening on. This costs you nothing, and it really helps to promote the show in the algorithm. There will be no new episode next week, as I will have family visiting from out of town. When the History Sphere returns in 2 weeks, I will take a closer look at Nikita Khrushchev, the man whose personality and policies would define the next decade of Soviet history, seeing the country rise to unprecedented heights while simultaneously sowing the seeds of its decline and fall. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.